150 feet directly below the surface of the Adriatic Sea, there is no light, no fresh air, and absolutely no room for error. The trapped men sealed inside this steel tube are completely silent. Above them, the deafening roar of Italian destroyer propellers cuts through the water, followed by the terrifying rhythmic ping of active sonar hunting for a target.
Then comes the dreaded splash, sinking directly toward them.
Seconds later, the ocean violently erupts, brutally shaking the hull and instantly blowing out the dim red emergency lights. Icy water begins to spray from a rusted, failing pipe. By all conventional military logic, this exhausted crew should already be dead. Their submarine is not a marvel of modern naval engineering. It is a terrifyingly obsolete, rotting relic built 15 years earlier, mockingly dismissed by the enemy as a floating tomb. Yet somehow this fragile, claustrophobic tin can is about to become the most feared phantom in the entire Mediterranean Sea. Deep sea warfare is a terrifying game of cat and mouse, where one single mistake means an instant watery grave. If you want more gripping, untold stories of military history and claustrophobic thrillers, you need to subscribe right now. Turn on notifications to never miss our next deep dive. Hit the like button and leave your comment down below. The year was 1940, and the Mediterranean Sea was rapidly transforming into a hostile, unforgiving battlefield. The mighty Italian Royal Navy boasted one of the largest and most advanced fleets on the entire planet, patrolling the waters with absolute arrogance. They possessed heavily armored cruisers, fast destroyers, and highly lethal submarines. In stark contrast, the Greek naval forces were critically underfunded and severely outdated. Among their meager fleet was a vessel that the enemy commanders openly mocked as a totally useless relic of a forgotten era. It was an aging, rusted submarine built in France over a decade prior, plagued by constant mechanical failures, deafening internal noise, and a severely limited diving capacity. The Italian High Command confidently classified this obsolete piece of junk as completely harmless. They genuinely believed it would either sink itself due to poor maintenance or be effortlessly blown to pieces within the first few days of open conflict. But they fundamentally misunderstood the dangerous combination of a desperate crew and an unforgiving ocean. The men assigned to this fragile steel cylinder knew they were essentially climbing into a pressurized coffin. Every time they sealed the heavy iron hatch, they understood the terrifying reality that they might never breathe fresh air again. Yet, instead of hiding in shallow coastal waters, this doomed crew chose to sail directly into the hunting grounds of the vastly superior enemy fleet. What followed was a grueling 5-year nightmare of psychological torment, extreme stealth, and raw survival. Operating blindly in the crushing black depths, this discarded machine became a lethal underwater ghost. This is the harrowing true story of the most claustrophobic game of dangerous underwater roulette ever played, and the obsolete submarine that systematically dismantled an empire's vast naval pride. Stepping inside the submarine was like entering the belly of a mechanical beast that was slowly suffocating itself. The stench was immediate and overpowering, a vile mixture of diesel fumes, stale sweat, rotting cabbage, and the metallic tang of battery acid. There was no room to stand fully upright. The rusted steel bulkheads closed in from every side, dripping with cold, salty condensation. The crew of 40 men was packed into a space barely large enough to hold half that number, sharing cramped bunks that were always warm and perpetually damp. The machinery surrounding them hummed with an unstable, rattling vibration that vibrated through their very bones. This was not a sophisticated weapon of modern war. It was an aging, fragile iron tube, pushed far beyond its intended limits. The mission was practically suicidal. They were ordered to slip past the heavy enemy blockades and strike the heavily defended Italian supply convoys navigating the treacherous Adriatic Sea. The enemy destroyers were fast, equipped with the latest sonar technology, and armed to the teeth with devastating depth charges. In a direct confrontation on the surface, the obsolete Greek submarine would be instantly blown out of the water. Their only advantage was the suffocating darkness of the deep ocean. As the heavy iron hatch slammed shut and the massive locking wheel was violently spun into place, the men were completely sealed away from the world above. The commander gave the order to dive, and the aging diesel engines were abruptly silenced, replaced by the eerie, high-pitched whine of the electric motors. The deck tilted sharply beneath their feet. The pressure hull groaned and popped loudly as the ocean began to squeeze the vessel. They were sinking into a cold, hostile, pitch-black abyss, completely blind, relying solely on their crude instruments and the absolutely terrifying element of pure surprise. The first real test of their fragile vessel came in the dead of night, under the shadow of the Albanian coastline. The sea was violently choppy on the surface, but below it was an eerie, suspended void. The sonar operator, locked in a tiny, sweat-drenched closet, suddenly ripped his headphones off his ears, his face completely pale. He had picked up the unmistakable, heavy, rhythmic churning of massive bronze propellers. It was an Italian convoy, heavily escorted by aggressive, fast-moving destroyers. The Greek commander, a man whose face was lined with deep exhaustion, quietly ordered the submarine to periscope depth. They were about to poke the sleeping bear. Raising the periscope was a massive risk. The friction of the aging mechanical seals squealed dangerously, a sound that felt loud enough to carry across the entire ocean. Through the crosshairs, the commander spotted the dark silhouettes of massive cargo ships loaded with crucial enemy supplies. The targeting process was agonizingly slow, relying on completely outdated manual calculations written in greasy pencil on a cramped, dimly lit plotting table. The crew held their breath. The order to fire the torpedoes was barely a whisper. The submarine violently shuddered as the compressed air launched the heavy weapons out of the forward tubes. Now, there was absolutely nothing to do but wait. The seconds dragged into what felt like hours. Then, a massive, muffled detonation ripped through the ocean.
Hard rudder, full speed ahead! Bear 340, attack the contact!
Sending a violent shockwave slamming into the submarine's hull. They had scored a direct, devastating hit. But the brief moment of triumph was instantly vaporized by sheer, suffocating terror. The escorts had spotted their torpedo wake. Above them, the water boiled as the Italian destroyers sharply turned, their massive engines roaring as they charged directly toward the submerged predator. "Dive deep," the commander ordered, his voice steady, despite the overwhelming dread filling the cramped control room. The old submarine groaned in loud, terrifying protests as it angled down into the crushing black depths. The men silently grabbed onto pipes and bulkheads.
Damage report, now! We're taking on water, stern compartment. Secure that hatch.
Desperately bracing themselves for the inevitable retaliation. Suddenly, the sonar pinging began. It was a sharp, rhythmic, mechanical screech that echoed through the steel hull like the terrifying footsteps of an approaching executioner. Ping, ping. The enemy knew exactly where they were. The first depth charge detonated with concussive force that threw men violently to the steel deck. The lights instantly shattered, plunging the entire crew into absolute, suffocating darkness. Searing water began spraying violently from a fractured valve, filling the tight compartment with blinding steam. The fragile, mocked, and obsolete submarine was suddenly trapped in a terrifying underwater cage, surrounded by an angry fleet intent on completely crushing them into the ocean floor. O Gemini Dis. The emergency red lights flickered to life, casting a bloody rhythmic glow over the panicked faces of the crew. The freezing spray from the ruptured valve was deafening, a high-pressure jet that cut through the skin like a knife. Two sailors lunged forward, throwing their entire body weight against a heavy manual wrench, fighting to seal the leak as the icy water pooled around their ankles. In the terrifying silence that followed the first explosion, the commander gave the most dreaded order in submarine warfare. Ultra quiet. All engines stop. Every piece of machinery that wasn't vital for survival was abruptly shut down. The ventilation fans stopped spinning, and the air immediately turned thick, humid, and heavy. The temperature inside the steel hull began to climb rapidly, fueled by the body heat of 40 terrified men. They sat in the dark, some clutching wooden rosaries, others staring blankly at the sweating pipes above their heads. Every movement had to be slow and deliberate to conserve the rapidly dwindling oxygen. The only sound left was the slow, agonizing drip of condensation and the frantic, shallow breathing of the crew. Outside, the ocean was a crushing weight. The aging hull, built 15 years earlier for much shallower waters, groaned and popped as the pressure squeezed the metal. It sounded like a giant foot slowly stepping on an aluminum can. This was the obsolete nature of their ship turned into a psychological weapon against them. Every creak felt like the final warning before the steel snapped. Above them, the Italian destroyers were still circling, their active sonar pings striking the hull with a metallic clink that resonated through the men's teeth. It was a predatory game of patience. The enemy had the sun and the air. The Greek crew had only the dark and their silence. As the hours passed, the air grew foul with carbon dioxide. Lungs began to burn, and heads throbbed with a dull, insistent pain. They were buried alive in a tomb of their own choosing, waiting for the ocean or the next explosion to finish them off. The air inside the hull had become a thick, poisonous soup of carbon dioxide and despair. Men were slumped against the machinery, their skin slick with cold, oily sweat, moving as little as possible to save every last molecule of oxygen. Above, the rhythmic thrum of the Italian propellers finally began to fade into the distance. The enemy commanders, convinced that no vessel built 15 years ago could possibly survive such a brutal pounding, finally turned their ships away, leaving what they assumed was a silent tomb behind. But the tomb was still breathing. With a slow, agonizing groan, the Greek commander gave the order to blow the ballast tanks. The ancient pumps struggled, screaming in protest as they fought the immense pressure of the deep. For a terrifying moment, the submarine remained motionless, pinned to the seabed by the weight of the ocean. Then, with a sudden, violent lurch, the steel hull broke free. As they breached the surface under a thick blanket of fog, the hatch was flung open. The rush of cold, salt-laden air was so sharp it made the men's lungs scream in pain. But it was the sweetest thing they had ever tasted. They had survived, but they were no longer the same men who had dived hours before. The obsolete relic had slipped through the fingers of a modern fleet once again. In the naval ports of the Mediterranean, whispers began to spread among the Italian sailors about a ghost boat that refused to die. This was the birth of the legend, a phantom that didn't rely on technology, but on the sheer, terrifying endurance of a crew that had already accepted their own deaths. They were now a psychological shadow, a predator that could never be truly found, haunting the very empire that had mocked them. For 5 long, agonizing years, this cycle of terror became their only reality. Seasons changed on the surface. Summers turned into winters over the Mediterranean. But inside the cramped steel hull, time was measured only in the rhythmic drip of condensation and the dwindling supply of canned food. The obsolete submarine was now a patchwork of desperate, frantic repairs. Every valve was scarred by pliers, every pipe was reinforced with makeshift clamps, and the hull itself was a roadmap of dents from near-miss depth charges. The crew no longer looked like the proud young sailors who had first boarded. They were hollow-eyed ghosts with skin the color of grey ash, their hands permanently stained with black grease and sea salt. They had become a living extension of the machine, navigating by pure instinct through a sea that desperately wanted them dead. The Italian High Command was humiliated. They had deployed their most advanced sonar-equipped destroyers to hunt a floating relic, yet the Greek Phantom continued to strike. It would appear suddenly from the dark, unleash its torpedoes into the heart of a vital convoy, and vanish back into the abyss before the escorts could even turn their guns. To the enemy sailors, the submarine wasn't just a vessel anymore, it was a psychological curse. They began to dread the calm, moonless nights, knowing that somewhere beneath the black waves, a silent, rusted predator was watching their every move through a scratched periscope lens. But the true cost was hidden within the men themselves. The constant, crushing pressure of the deep had a way of flattening the human spirit. They lived in a state of permanent hypervigilance, where a dropped wrench or a loud cough could mean a sudden death sentence. The sound of a sonar ping, that sharp, metallic clink, had become a permanent resident in their nightmares. Even when they were granted brief moments of shore leave, they couldn't sleep in wide-open rooms. They craved the cramped, suffocating safety of the steel walls. They were a crew of the living dead, bound together by a shared secret, that they had survived the impossible so many times that they no longer feared the end. They simply waited for it, one silent dive at a time. The war eventually came to an end, but the echoes of those 5 years remained trapped forever within the rusted, salt-scarred hull of the Greek submarine. When it finally returned to port for the last time, it didn't look like a victor. It looked like a haunting relic of a nightmare that refused to stay buried. The obsolete label that the Italian commanders had used as a mockery now stood as a badge of impossible defiance. This fragile tin can had not only survived the crushing depths and the relentless rain of depth charges, but it had fundamentally changed the psychology of Mediterranean naval warfare. It proved that in the terrifying, claustrophobic darkness of the deep, advanced technology is often secondary to the raw, unyielding willpower of a crew that refuses to break. The men who climbed out of that hatch into the blinding sunlight of peace were changed forever. They carried the silence of the abyss in their eyes and the rhythmic ping of sonar in their hearts. They had lived for half a decade in a world where every breath was a calculated risk and every mechanical groan was a potential death knell. Their story remains one of the most intense, claustrophobic chapters of the Second World War, a chilling reminder that arrogance is the most dangerous leak a navy can have. The Phantom of the Adriatic didn't just sink ships, it sank the very idea that an old machine is a useless one. In the end, the most powerful weapon wasn't the torpedoes or the engines, it was the 40 terrified, exhausted men who dared to breathe together in the dark.